no way. I would have had no way to have imagined that, because at that particular time, I was really circling the drain. And I want to talk to you about that experience of circling the drain and coming out from it. Um, I want to begin with some gratitude. And I've gone back and forth in my mind about whether to use PowerPoint or not. You know, I know we've all had that kind of death by PowerPoint experience with professional presentations, but I am going to use PowerPoint here a little bit today. So let me see if I can share this screen. Yeah, there we go. And there are some particular people, some colleagues, and some of you are on this call today that I want to specifically name because these folks really had my back during the dark night. And they are Tom Nielsen and Laurel Brown and Jamie Kine, Kirsten Kropp, Carol Milam, Deb Leinert, Joan Furman, Kenneth Robinson, Kim Ratcliffe, Blair Morris, Tom Knowles Bagwell, Keith Metter, Bill Petrie, and from out of town, James Seymour and Kathy Higbee and Jeannie Zandy. And then the late Dr. Roy Elam, who's my partner in crime and dear friend, who was the medical director at the Vanderbilt Center for Integrative Health. So in this lifetime, I've had sort of three incarnations. I have been an Episcopal priest for 45 years. I've been a psychotherapist for 35 years and a meditation teacher for 30 years. And I think the red thread through all of this lifetime has been my love for contemplative practice. And that's happened in several different arenas. In Christian contemplative practice, particularly with my teachers, the Dutch Catholic priest Henry Nouwen and Thomas Keating, the Trappist monk Thomas Keating, and in the Buddhist world, the Buddhist Theravada and Zen and Tibetan or Vajrayana teachers. In the Buddhist world, Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach and Philip Moffitt, and then in the Tibetan world, a Tibetan teacher named Soni Rinpoche, as well as Dan Brown. And then finally, in the Hindu Advaita Vedanta world, Adyashanti and Rupert Spira. So I think lineage is really important, and digging not just sort of casual, superficial spiritual wells, but really digging deeply has been my primary interest in this lifetime. One way to think about mindfulness practice is that there are, at least in the Western experience of mindfulness practices, there are at least three lenses of mindfulness. And the first two are what we call deliberate mindfulness. And that's what we call focused attention or concentration. When neurologists do scans on the brains of meditators, they're looking at parts of the brain that are looking at focused attention, using concentration or what are called samadhi practices. And these practices, I know Tom Nielsen in his recent presentation talked about the default mode network. This is our kind of ordinary walking around personality way of looking at things. And when we're concentrated, whether in spiritual practice or in sports or doing pottery or carpentry or whatever it might be, that suppresses this default mode network and we feel better. Concentration brings calmness, as we like to say. The second kind of mindfulness is what we could call open monitoring. And this is also known as choiceless awareness, or in the Buddhist world, vipassana. And this is a more open sort of space. It's sort of like sitting on the banks of the Harpeth River and simply watching the contents of the mind come down the river. There's a bit of a separation from from contents and the witnesses looking at different parts of experience. And then there's a third, and I think this is less well known in the West, but a kind of mindfulness called effortless mindfulness. And this would be non-dual awareness. And it's an atypical mind state. It's a different brain state. Tibetans call it Rigpa. And it's also known as simply being aware of being aware. One of my teachers is a Benedictine monk named Brother David Stendhal-Rast, and he said, when you're talking about meditation, show, don't tell. So I want to actually do a little bit of practice here together with you, and give you a little bit of taste of this. People ask me these days, what are you doing? And I say, well, these days, kind of 70 years into my life, I'm really no longer doing single malt, straight up intensive psychotherapy. And I'm not really doing spiritual direction. I'm doing what I call conversational companionship. And essentially, what I'm doing is teaching people how to use meditative practices, both, as we would say, on the cushion in formal meditative practice, and then off the cushion in daily life. So let's do a little bit of this kind of practice so that you can get a bit of a taste of it. So I'm going to ask you just to establish your posture with feet on the floor and letting your hands rest on your thighs or in your lap, wherever they're comfortable for you. And I'm going to let my eyes gently close. You can have your eyes open or closed, whatever is best for you. And there are 4 somatic markers for sitting meditation. And the first marker is grounding. And this is simply inviting your body to sink and soften into the support of your chair. Feeling yourself supported from underneath, so that the bones of your feet are supported from the floor, and the bones of your hands are supported where you're resting down. And then imagining a thin, strong thread attached to the crown of your head. And that thread is just lifting up into the sky, so that the vertebrae of your spine are like beads on a string. And they're just lining up. So there's a kind of central vertical core that's coming into alignment. At the same time, the appendages, the arms and hands and legs and feet are resting down. The body's a little bit like a puppet on a string. And then feeling into space in the room in which you're sitting. And noticing the space behind your body. And the space in front of you. The space to your left. And the space to your right. The space above your body. And the space below. And then tuning into the space inside your body. The body is actually mostly space. So imagining inside space and outside space as one space, interpenetrating. And then dropping your awareness down from the thought factory down to the heart center. It's this 12-inch drop. This is the distance of the spiritual journey, the journey from the thought factory down to open-heartedness. And imagine as you bring attention to your breathing, that you could breathe in through the sternum, as it were, through the front door of the heart on the in-breath, and all the way through the heart and out the back door of the heart and into the space behind you. And then from the space behind you, through the back door of the heart, out the front door, and out into the space in front of you. So we're just aerating the heart here. Softening the cage of protectiveness around the heart. And perhaps making contact with a kind of open-heartedness and open-mindedness. So these 4 somatic markers are grounding and aligning, spaciousness, and open-heartedness. Finally, notice that all these somatic markers are contents in consciousness. The felt sense of the body being supported. The sense of central vertical lift along with Shushumna. The sense of being held in space and the open heart's connection with this space. All these are contents in consciousness. So here's a question for our inquiry, and that is, what knows these contents? What knows this breathing? What knows this felt sense of underside support? We're doing a kind of figure ground shift here. We're being aware of awareness itself and bringing awareness, or Rigpa, as the Tibetans call it, front and center. So here's a little quotation from Ramakrishna, the 19th century Bengali mystic. Ramakrishna says, "The winds of grace are always blowing, but we have to raise our sails to catch them." I love this phrase. The winds of grace are always blowing, but we have to raise our sails to catch them. I want to talk with you to use, as it were, as a kind of case study, my most recent book, which is called The Body Knows the Way. I'll hold it up here for you to take a look at. This is a small book. It's only about 110 pages. It is small, but I would have to say it's rather dense. It's not exactly beach reading, but I want to do a little bit of I want to read a couple of chunks to you, just to give you a little bit of the flavor of the territory that I'm exploring. And the frontispiece of this book is a quotation from Leonard Cohen. Tom Nielsen put me on to Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen says, "I like those singers who would just lay out their predicament and tell their story." And then I thought I could be one of those guys. So the introduction is entitled "Nailed to Your Own Predicament." And that's a phrase from Leonard Cohen. He says, Leonard Cohen, Jew, Buddhist practitioner, Zen student, he says, he talks about Jesus being nailed to the cross of his predicament. What an incredibly powerful image that is. And so I want to be talking with you a little bit about my experience of this. I had not seen it coming, even though much of my day is sitting with people who are nailed to their own predicaments. They show up at my office door and tell me about the death of their child, about the disappearance of someone they love into addiction, about the slow erosion of a relationship, about their failures and someone else's failures, about the unavailability of what they long for, about resenting and not forgiving, about family hurts and distance and entrapment, about their sense of loneliness and not belonging. They tell me about the loss of their illusions of innocence, of safety, of control. When my wife Kathy died 13 years after her diagnosis, I was shattered. I came apart. My come apart was altogether unexpected, at least by me. Unexpected because Kathy had walked through her dying with such grace, and I somehow figured I would continue in that grace after she was gone, because her death was luminous in a way I had never before witnessed. And all through her dying, I was protected and pervaded by her luminosity. Because the sense of Kathy's presence lingered for weeks after her death, and because my sorrow in the first weeks of grief was tender and quiet, even sweet, until it wasn't. Kathy and I had been married less than 3 years when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. This was a second marriage for both of us, and we found in our life together what we had been looking for all our lives. The sweet gleam of mutual recognition. Oh, we understand one another, delight in one another, feel safe and altogether welcomed in each other's company, and know that we can talk about everything and work through anything, characterized all the days of our life together. And then I go on and say a bit about Kathy, about who she was. Kathy was the head of a lower school at University School, and she and I collaborated in teaching mindfulness practices in various venues. I would have to say that Kathy was the least self-promoting leader that I have ever been around in my entire life. She was, I think, for those of you who know her, she was a remarkable person. So I talk a little bit about our relationship and the quality of our relationship. And then I go into a section and it has a subtitle, Broken Window. Many months after the shattering came upon me, I was walking with my dear friend, Paloma Kane. Paloma knows just when to text me with, "Like to walk? Have tea today?" She listens, gives me plenty of room to be however I am. She does not ask questions or make suggestions. She never fills in the silences with chatter. She spares me the dreaded question, "How are you?" I hate that question. I can tell Paloma gets it. Though she is decades younger and married and has never lost a spouse, she somehow understands how it is with me. I think she's an old soul. Sometimes we do not talk much on our walks. If sobbing is how it is with me, she just lets me be sad and we keep walking. It feels quite natural, this sorrow and silence and walking. I don't feel any pressure from Paloma to pull myself together. We always walk beside the creek that runs through my neighborhood. People say that Native Americans once lived here beside this creek, which somehow comforts me. And sometimes I feel the invisible presence of the long disappeared ones. I like walking with Paloma more than walking alone. One day, when I could hear this story, she told me about a cathedral window that was deliberately smashed during the English Civil War. An enormous stained glass window, the largest one in the cathedral, was shattered into 1,000 fragments. Somehow, all those pieces of glass were gathered and kept in hiding. For 18 years, the fragments remained hidden until the political climate changed. When the fragments were brought out of hiding, it was not possible to reconstruct the original window. All the stained glass saints and biblical figures who once stood guard over the main entrance to the cathedral were lost, at least in their original form. Someone had the idea to bring the shattered pieces of glass together in a completely new way. The cathedral glassworkers made a mosaic of the fragments, a mosaic that looks strangely modern. I wonder sometimes how long it took the glassworkers to rework all those fragments into an altogether different whole. This was in 1660 at Winchester Cathedral. You can see the window there today, the old and great new west window. So I used this image of the shattered and reconstructed window as a kind of trope that runs through the narrative of the book. But to come to the point that I really want to share with y'all, there's a subsection in this introduction called shock therapy, and it gives you kind of the essence of what I want to talk to you about today. Do not need to go into all the details of it here, only to say that several months after Kathy's death, it seized me. Twice before it had seized me, and it was no stranger. Even now, I do not have a good name for it. I know its clinical names, but they do not do it justice. People said to me, "This is grief. It takes time. You two were so close. You did everything together. It will get better." Other friends, therapists all, were worried about me. They knew my history of anxious depression, how twice it had nearly taken me under, how the second time was worse than the first. After a year and a half of what was called grief, then complicated grief, then depression, then treatment-resistant depression, I checked myself into a residential treatment program. My psychiatrist, Bill Petrie, and I agreed this was what I needed to do. No psychotherapy or medication or spiritual practice had worked in all this time to relieve my unremitting anxiety, inconsolable sadness, and growing despair. Nothing eased the predicament to which I was nailed. I could not figure how to pull myself out of it and together again. So I took my treatment-resistant depression and went to residential treatment. I was 6 weeks there in the care of capable and kind people who kept me alive. My psychiatrist, Dr. James Seymour, a thoughtful and open-hearted man, acknowledged after 6 weeks that residential treatment was simply not working for my treatment-resistant depression. I was psychotically depressed. He said to me, "I think you need to go home for ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy." And so on Christmas Eve, I flew home to begin ECT the day after Christmas. Dr. Bill Petrie, my psychiatrist at home, the preserver of hope through month after month of unremitting pain, put his hand on my shoulder and gently said, "We'll get this." Having no hope for myself, I very much needed his. Some months later, he could tell me that after 3 sessions of ECT, I was going to be all right, that I was coming out of the horror of it all. I had 4 more sessions of shock therapy. ECT famously messes with memory. I had no memory of that Christmas or January or February. All I know is that ECT saved my life. Before ECT, I was drowning endlessly in despair. After ECT, I was no longer drowning. I was emotionally numb, but being numb was such an improvement. I cannot tell you what an improvement it was. I still do not have a good name for the awfulness of the time before ECT. Ben Curtis, my friend and spiritual companion, had said to me, "Gordon, you're in the dark night." That's as good a name as I know for the territory I was traveling. This was depression, to be sure, but more. Sometimes great loss and major depression combine to kick you into the dark night. Sometime after I had finished my course of ECT, I came across a phrase from the songwriter Leonard Cohen, and when I read it, I wept for a long time. I wept because I felt like Leonard Cohen understood me. His phrase was, "Nailed to the cross of your predicament." Oh, Leonard Cohen gets it, I said to myself. When you are shattered, you are nailed to the cross of your predicament. When you are in the dark night, you are nailed to the cross of your predicament. 3 months after the last session of ECT, the numbness slowly wore off and tiny pleasures began to creep into my awareness. The freshness of smells and sounds of spring, the freedom of walking by the creek in my neighborhood, gladness at the company of friends who had loved me through it all and who were so visibly relieved to see me feeling better. And yet, though I really was feeling better, I could not feel any, what can I call it, because words are inadequate, any spiritual connection. I could not feel any sense of belonging to that luminous presence that I had known as a boy in Winchester Cathedral. That refers to a piece that I left out in reading to you, that I had shared with Kathy in her living and dying. I was talking with Bill Petrie about this disconnect. He knew how important this connection was to me. Bill thought for a minute and said, "That's the hell of it. The dark night robs you of your sense of connection with the people you love and with God." When he said this, I knew Bill knew. He got it. He rightly did not reassure me that this belonging would return. Reassurance, he knew, would have been cheap. He simply named what was true for me at that moment. A mentor of mine once said that when people are going through the valley of the shadow, nailed to their predicament, what helps is not what we can say, but what we can bear to hear. My psychiatrist heard me and met me right where I was without getting ahead of me. I think he trusted my healing, and he knew that healing has its own timing. He knew from long experience that some things take a while. So I want to see if I can share with you briefly what helped me after the biological reset of ECT. I do think that for me, at least, that biological reset was life-saving. As I said, I will always be grateful for electricity. Thank you, Thomas Edison. But for me to return and actually deepen the spiritual connection that I had known before this dark night, I came across what I came to call 3 essentials. And they are unhooking and stepping back, turning and looking and tuning in and relaxing. And this is really what the bulk of this book is about. Unhooking and stepping back really came out of a conversation that I had with my buddy Laurel Brown. Laurel Brown was talking to me about Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul. Some of you probably know that book. And what we're doing with unhooking and stepping back, let's say there's content, let's just say worry, catastrophizing, awfulizing, worry. And so you notice, okay, this is the content in my mind. But what you do, if you can see my hands, what you do is, as it were, you just unhook and step back into this observing, witnessing posture. You're dropping, as it were, from the thought factory where all these thoughts of worry and catastrophizing are going on. And you're dropping down into an embodied knowing. That's a kind of good working definition of mindfulness. Mindfulness is relaxed, embodied awareness. The second move, and I think this is really not on the Western psychological map, and this is why I am so grateful to my Buddhist teachers. Turning and looking is actually it's a figure ground shift. It's a rotation in consciousness. So what we do is we're looking at, say, at contents in consciousness, aka worry in this case, or despair. And what we do is we, as it were, rotate consciousness and bring the awareness that knows these contents into the front. This is also known as being aware of being aware. And I want to ask you, in your family of origin, in your spiritual training or none that you received growing up, in your professional training, in your psychotherapeutic training, did anybody ever invite you to be aware of consciousness itself? To be aware of awareness itself. This was really the turning point for me, this turning and looking. Before, I had been doing what I came to call misguided mindfulness. I was really trying to be present to my mental contents, my emotional contents, the embodied manifestation of these contents. And I, as it were, I was really keeping my nose to the grindstone. I was trying to work through my pain. And in fact, I think that this was, as I came to understand, misguided. What I needed to actually do was to unhook and to be able to step back and turn and look. But here's the piece that I think, at least in my own professional psychotherapeutic training, was simply not present. And I saw that David Yerian is on the call, and David is just one of my favorite people in the universe, because David was my therapist once upon a time in my second depression. And he said to me, when things were really melting down, he said, "Gordon, have you ever thought about doing yoga?" And I said, "David, I've never thought about doing yoga." And he said, "Well, you could go see my wife, Sandy Anders, and do yoga with her." And it was Sandy who really introduced me to bodily awareness. And what we in the mindfulness world call the felt sense of emotional experience. It was important for me to be able to drop into the felt sense of my anxiety, my anger, my sorrow, my despair, and to find the felt sense of it. But I needed to be able to link that with something else. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. I'm going to skip I'm really going to skip the bulk of the book and come to the epilogue, because I want to read you just a little chunk from there. looking back on the last 5 years, I can see more clearly what triggered my descent into the dark night. And by the way, parenthetically, it was really therapeutic for me to write this book. I hope this book will be helpful for somebody else who's going through their own experience of shattering and dark night, but it sure as hell was helpful for me to write it. I remember my old supervisor, Volney Gay, talking about St. Augustine and St. Augustine's Confessions, and how Augustine really healed himself. It was really the first example of this in Western literature in the writing of his Confessions. So when I was cut off from the security of Kathy's embodied presence, I lost my way in the world. As long as Kathy was alive, I knew where I was and who I was. Even as she was dying, Kathy held me in her gaze until her very last hours. We stayed with one another altogether reliably until the end. After Kathy's death, all through the next month, I felt her near and found myself resting in quiet and simple serenity. Because my sweet and secure attachment with Kathy gave me a sense of being at home in the world, when I lost that feeling of connection, I was shattered. I found myself in the dark night. I had yet to see at the time of Kathy's death, or even through discovering what I just described to you, the essentials and the writing of this book, what was at the heart of the predicament that I had known in this life. It wasn't until I began working with a teacher, this is an out-of-town teacher named Jeannie Zandy, that the dark night really began to make sense to me. It was more than depression, more than anxiety, more even than the loss of any sense of the nurturing divine. Jeannie had suffered her way through her own 4-year dark night. When she spoke about her experience, I knew that she knew with terrible intimacy the territory I had been in. I went to work with Jeannie because I knew that even though I had survived my own dark night, there was still something unfinished. There was still something I had not reckoned with. I was managing well enough, no longer in agony, connected with presence and open-hearted awareness. I was teaching and sitting with the people who come to talk to me with ease, teaching and working more often than not from a space of luminous consciousness. And then the bottom fell out. I found myself slipping into the dark night again, and it utterly terrified me. I learned in my work with Jeannie how the developmental trauma of my premature birth and my first month in the incubator without my mother's touch had left me with the terror of an abandoned infant, a terror that seized me whenever I felt at all insecure in my attachments. Because of my mother's own trauma, the loss of her father at age 2 and her mother's isolating depression, in spite of my mother's caring for me, she was unable to provide a reliable, secure, and safe presence. I learned early on that to be safe in the world, I needed to take care of my mother. Some of you know this story. And the best way I could do that was to please her and try to be the perfect child. Anytime I failed in these tasks, all hell broke loose. My mother's verbal anger scared me to death. It was unsafe to communicate with my mother when she was hijacked by her own feelings. Furthermore, because she did not know how to comfort herself, she could not teach me to be with my own fear, anger, shame, and sadness. Much of my adult life has been spent learning how to be with these feelings and helping others learn to compassionately hold them as well. But until my work with Jeannie, I did not fully get just how terrified, enraged, shameful, grief-stricken, and desperate my early life had been. Jeannie gave me a new name for my dark night: developmental trauma. What triggered this re-entry into the dark night was falling back into my core trauma, desperate for connection, unable to secure it, filled with terror and grief at feeling abandoned and rejected. With help, I came to see that my present day terror was an emotional flashback to my early childhood experience. And so I took myself back to therapy. But this time, therapy was different than I had experienced it before. From the very beginning of our work together, My therapist, Deb Leinert, understood the roots of my desperation, how it came about in my early failures of attachment, and how it kept showing up in my present day experiences. Working with Deb, I came to see that there were levels of pain I simply could not access, much less heal on my own. I needed a safe and knowledgeable and compassionate person to help me find the way home. The therapist needed a therapist. So in the course of this time that I was working with Deb, I was also exploring internal family systems, what in mindfulness lingo is known as effortless mindfulness, and something that my friend Kim Ratcliffe put me onto, which I'd never heard before, and it's called the comprehensive resource model. I'm curious to know how many of you know about CRM, or the comprehensive resource model. Comprehensive resource model employs yogic breathing techniques, energetic grids, spirit figures, spirit beings, spirit animals, bilateral stimulation, bilateral tones, and breathing. And I worked with through Kim's good offices, I worked with Lisa Schwartz, who is the founder of CRM. Her book on comprehensive resource model is really rich in neuroscience. I know a little bit about neuroscience, but this was way beyond my pay grade, I want to tell you. And Lisa's book, and I'll put this slide up in a minute, was a really helpful resource. But I just had 3 sessions with Lisa, but I have to say they blew my mind in terms of how much territory we covered, particularly around my my pre-verbal experience, my infantile experience. I want to tell you about a teacher named Shenzhen Yang, and his book is called The Science of Enlightenment. I don't have time to go into this today. I had hoped that I would be able to do it, but I am teaching about this book at One River, Nashville, and I'll put the link for that website up. I teach on Mondays, or sorry, first and third Wednesdays. We were meeting at Second Presbyterian Church, but we're meeting by Zoom through the pandemic. And I think that Shenzhen Yang has a really brilliant synthesis of psychotherapy and mindfulness practice. So I'm simply going to file that by title. Here are some written resources that were really, really helpful to me in the course of my recovery. The first is Locke Kelly's book. Locke Kelly is the former Tibetan practitioner, and his book, The Way of Effortless Mindfulness, is a beautiful book on mindfulness practice. Rupert Spira is an Advaita Vedanta teacher, and his little gem, it's a little book called Being Aware of Being Aware, is if you want to give yourself an early Christmas present, give yourself this book. It's just an absolutely, it's a little life-changing book. John Prendergast is a Bay Area psychotherapist. His book, The Deep Heart, has great somatic awareness. He's really just a big open heart. Pete Walker's Complex PTSD about developmental trauma is really helpful. Lisa Schwartz is the comprehensive resource model mentioned. Jay Early, my friend Jamie Kahn put me on to Jay Early's book on self-therapy. This is internal family systems, and it's kind of a cookbook. It's in some ways it's boringly repetitive like cookbooks, but it's a useful tool. And then I mentioned Shenzhen Yang, and then finally Daniel Brown. Daniel Brown is a medical professor, psychologist at Harvard Medical School, and he has written the book. This is a 750-page tome called Attachment Disturbances in Adults. And I want to tell you, he is absolutely brilliant. This is not going to be everybody's cup of tea. You're not going to want the review of the literature that he does in all this, but it is really, really great work if you have interest in attachment repair. So here's the link for One River Wisdom Nashville, and then my Gmail. I'd be happy to correspond with you, to be in touch with you. So I want to make the PowerPoint go away, and Melissa's got this and she can forward this to you. But I wanted to, in the last 10 minutes, just, I think we'll do this by chat. I think it's the most probably efficient way to do this. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have confusion, just type those into the chat, and we'll see what if anything comes up. Have I heard of Douglas Harding's The Headless Way? Richard Lang advocates for it now. I absolutely love Douglas Harding. So turning and looking back is what is looking is absolutely straight out of Douglas Harding's playbook. He has, I think his original book is called On Being Headless. But if you Google Douglas Harding, he's got a great website where he's got exercises for you to do this turning and looking thing. When I was first learning about turning and looking from the Tibetan teacher Sonia Rinpoche, I was on a week-long retreat. Now, there were 100 people in the room, and I thought, these other people are getting this, but the penny is not dropping for me. I am not getting this. But I remember specifically because it was Good Friday morning, and I had been on the retreat for a week when the penny dropped and this rotation in consciousness, this figure ground shift happened. And I remember just weeping and weeping and weeping with relief. And I looked up at the altar in front of the room, and there was this photograph of the Dalai Lama smiling at me. And I thought, this is good karma. Yeah. It was a breakthrough. Yeah. Richard Lang has condensed 15 course, 10 minutes in Sam Harris's Waking Up smartphone app. That's a great resource. Great. Yeah. Sam Harris, by the way, has an interview with Rupert Spira, and he absolutely did not get Rupert Spira at all. So everybody's got their own, preferences. This is from Tom. Tom, I just want to say I appreciate your courage and honesty in diving back into such a dark time with us. Thank you, Tom. And on so many levels, thank you, Tom. I know you all know this, how these shattering experience, when they're, I think metabolized doesn't really do the justice to the experience, but when they're somehow reorganized, they give us a new platform from which to work and to teach and to live and move and have our being, to use biblical language. Yeah, yeah. So, in a way I never would have said before, I have a kind of peculiar gratitude for having gone through and come through it. This is Judy. Judy, well, I love this question. What do you feel drawn to? What's coming next for you? So I really love this teacher, Dan Brown. Dan Brown is not only a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, and he has been the lead expert witness in sex abuse trials for Catholic priests who have abused children. So he's kind of a triple threat. He's psychologist, attachment guy, does this expert witness stuff. But for 50 years, he has been studying Tibetan and Sanskrit and Pali, and has been going over to Tibet to work with Tibetan and Nepal and Bhutan and India, and work with Buddhist teachers about translating esoteric meditation texts. His, if you Google Dan Brown, and by the way, he's got a great attachment treatment called the Ideal Parent Protocol. Google Ideal Parent Protocol, and his Tibetan Buddhist teaching website is called pointingoutway.org. Just Google Dan Brown. And he is a brilliant teacher. He unfortunately has Parkinson's disease right now. And so it's really challenging to understand him, but it is really worth it because he is such a deep practitioner. Yeah. Here's Michael. Do you have thoughts about Richard Rohr's sense of flow and spirituality? Oh yeah, Richard Rohr. Certainly, I don't know what we'd be doing without Richard Rohr in the Christian contemplative world these days. And yes, this effortless awareness, this atypical mind state, flow is another way of talking about that. Yeah, yeah. So here's Linda. Linda's my colleague from the Osher Center for Integrative Health. Could I say more about the importance of the somatic body-based work? So this is, this is really what they have on offer at Osher, is somatic body-based work across a number of modalities. And I simply have to say that my theological training, never once in my theological training did anybody invite me to be aware of anything from the neck down, right? And in my psychological training, and I'm older than a lot of y'all, but in my psychological training, I don't think anybody ever invited me to be aware of the body or breathing. I really had to go to Thich Nhat Hanh and the Buddhists and learn that from them. And I'm so grateful to them. And of course, as many of you know, there's a wonderful synthesis of conversation now going between, mindfulness-oriented psychotherapy, and there are lots of resources there. There are so many different modalities in the somatic world. And if you are unexplored in that area, Osher is a great place to begin the exploration. Yeah.
Well, guys, we have just a couple of minutes left.